Bill Oliver. I'm a retired research silviculturist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station. Well, I was born in Morrisville, New Jersey. Well, actually Trenton, that's the hospital. In what would be called now the Metroplex between Boston and Washington, D.C. And my father was a landscape gardener, and my mother a housewife, but she was a farm girl. And they both had interests in in the outdoors. My father was a sort of a amateur botanist, and he specialized in ferns. He liked ferns and mushrooms, and sort of the odd parts of the botanical world. And we used to go on lots of walks, botanical walks, and this time of year we would be out there looking at wildflowers in eastern Pennsylvania. So I liked that quite a bit. And my mother was a backyard bird watcher. So and she got me interested in birds at a young age. And when I got out of high school, well, in my senior year in high school, I had a history teacher, which I had most admired. And I thought, well, maybe I should go into history as a young person, as a career, but I didn't want to teach. It was, I knew I wasn't going to be an effective teacher, knew about that much. And but I did know, I did get an appreciation of a wide background in liberal arts. But I knew that if I went to, but I was afraid that if I went to forestry school right off the bat, it would be kind of like a training institute, which it subsequently turned out to be. But this was back in early 50s. But my father passed away when in my senior year in high school, so I decided I'd better get straightened out and go into forestry. And I should say that before that time, there was a fellow that attended our church, Elwood Moore, and he was assistant state forester for the state of New Jersey. Because New Jersey didn't have much of a forestry department, had nothing against Elwood Moore, but he took me out one time to a little forest woodlot where he was going to mark red fir, or not red fir, and it's taking me decades ahead, but red maple back east. This is a pioneer species in the east, and he was going to thin it. And he took me out, and he showed me what he was going to do and how he was going to do it and everything. And it just turned me on. I thought, this is it. It's a lot more romantic. Even red maple in a woodlot in North Jersey, it's a lot more romantic than raking leaves or mowing lawns as a landscape gardener. So when I got out of high school, I toyed with the idea of going to a liberal arts school and getting more of a well-rounded education than I would in a forestry school. But then, as I said, my father passed away, so I figured I better do it. So I had already had approval from Oberlin College in northeastern Ohio. I was going to go there, but I went to the University of New Hampshire anyway, and I went to a forestry school. And I enjoyed it, but I realized at the time that there were a lot of courses there and I remember talking to other people about it even then, that these are techniques that you should learn from the organization that you are that employed you, rather than what I needed from the University of New Hampshire was more of the bases for these techniques, not just the techniques themselves. They would vary between employers, but I needed the real background, and there was some of that, but not as much as I thought there should be. And then subsequently, I think that turned out to be the case, and there was a lot of, and so I don't think that lasted through the 60s, later on it was that way. But anyway, I enjoyed it. And then it came time to look for employment, and I got a job with the Umpqua National Forest. So anyway, I got there, and this is 1956, ancient history here. And they were just beginning to log in a big way the old-growth forests in southwest Oregon. And so my job was to assist on road location in the summertime, and in the winter, graphing cut and fill for the roads. And this was all done, before computers and everything. You had to graph paper, and you put it in, and you had a planimeter, and you went around, and you balanced cut and fill. And it sounds all very primitive, and I suppose by today's standards it is, but anyway, I said, well, this is civil engineering. I wanted something that had a biological science here. And I found out that, well, if you mind your P's and Q's, in a few years you can maybe get into something else. And I didn't think that I wanted to wait that long. So I quit. I was there about 9 months, I guess, and I quit. And I figured, well, I better go back to school and see if I could broaden my education and somehow get into something better than that. And so I went back to the University of Michigan. And there I sort of discovered research. And I thought, management, no, that's going to be civil engineering, or it's going to be personnel and all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to practice it as a biological science, so I thought I'd better go into research. Well, I didn't get a job immediately, but I got a job with the university, with the Michigan Department of Conservation, or Natural Resources as they call it now, and up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And I enjoyed it. Was there a couple of years. And then I found this opening for a job with the Pacific Southwest Forest and Range Experiment Stations, they called themselves in those days. And it was going to be in Hawaii. But by the time I applied, the Hawaiian job was filled, but then I got a letter from Douglas Roy, who was my supervisor for many years, that they would keep my records on my application on file. I said, yeah, I'm not holding my breath on that. But sure enough, in about less than a year, he wrote back and said, there's an opening in when you're still interested. And so I went so then I landed in Berkeley, where the job was in those days, with Doug, and we worked there for about a year, about a year, and he was involved with the silviculture in the northwest part of California, in Douglas fir. It was sort of a one-man project on there in Douglas fir. So we worked there, and then we were almost immediately reorganized. Well, it's because just before I arrived, there was quite a large silviculture project out of Berkeley, and most of those people had gone, and they were involved with old growth management. So there was an interest in young growth, doing something with the young growth management. Again, it was timber-oriented, always timber-oriented in those days. So Doug Roy and myself, we were transferred to Reading. And there was a small project there with Jim Griffin and Bob Eccles. And they were working in, well, Jim Griffin was an ecologist, and he was there for a few years, and then was hired by the University of California and was at Hastings for many years. And then Eccles was actually a geneticist, and he transferred to Placerville and was manager there for a few years. And then he went to Hawaii. So Doug Roy and I were there, and sort of by ourselves for a while before there was a consolidation of other people that came. Don Gordon from Susanville, and Phil McDonald from the Challenge area, Oroville area. Oh, and at about that time, Doug Roy put on my desk this study plan for west-wide levels of growing stocks study for young growth ponderosa pine. And I always thought I was never real good in mathematics. I considered myself more of an ecological orientation. But this was an assignment here, and it's interesting because this was a west-wide study. It was devised by a committee that met in Berkeley at the same time that I arrived in Berkeley, but I didn't know anything about it. And I don't know whether Doug was involved with it or not. I don't think he was. Anyway, it was designed to be for the then 4 research stations. Then there was the Rocky Mountain, Intermountain, Pacific Northwest, and Pacific Southwest. Now, since now there's only 3 because the Intermountain and Rocky Mountain are combined. Anyway, they were all supposed to find these young growth natural stands, mostly. Well, it was all supposed to be natural stands of ponderosa pine, and they were going to put in these large areas of having 18 plots was the original plan of half-acre plots and then with a surround that makes them almost 3/4 or almost an acre in size. A large area of very uniform conditions, stand conditions and site conditions in pure ponderosa pine. And it was, the main plan was devised by a fellow by the name of Clifford Myers from the Rocky Mountain Station, and he worked in the Black Hills, where ponderosa pine grows in a very uniform way. Unlike ponderosa pine in the northern Rockies, or certainly in California. So we had a little trouble getting plots, and in fact the Rocky Mountains, as well as Al Stage was involved in trying to find the plots in northern Rockies, and he couldn't find it. He bailed out. And by that time we had hired Bob Powers as a summer employee. And then then we hired him on because he looked like he had real talent. And even though he only had a bachelor's degree from Humboldt State, we hired him as a full-time, as a scientist. I don't know how we did that exactly, but anyway, we did. And he and I teamed up together, and we traveled up and down the Sierras one summer trying to find pure ponderosa pine stands with a large enough area that we could establish the study. And we only found one, and I didn't think that was good because it was so dense that if you ever thinned it, it would all fall down. It was like some of it already had like a field of wheat in a Kansas tornado. So that didn't do it. So we'd have to go in there and we'd have to thin it and then and then groom it so that we could have the main study. And that would take 10 years or more. So maybe that was we couldn't do that. So we finally found a plantation down on the Tahoe, which met our needs. It didn't have quite enough area. I had to make the study a little smaller. But it was a plantation, which turned out we got a lot of information from that over the years. But that was, and then of course, I was the young kid on the block as far as this westward study was concerned. So immediately, of course, I was made to be coordinator or chairman or something, and I had to arrange periodic meetings and that sort of thing. Well, it was to determine the effect of levels of growing stock on the growth of ponderosa pine, young growth ponderosa pine. So we had to have a very uniform stand condition so that we could be sure that our treatment was the reason for there were differences in the growth rates. And that was there'd been a little bit of work in that before, especially with in the nation there was work with red pine, and but not in ponderosa pine much, a little bit in the Black Hills. That's where Cliff Myers was working, and that's the study plan generally that we adopted. So I worked out on that at the first, and then during that time, I would come across in visits to various ranger stations, find these administrative studies that somebody had started, mostly in the northeastern California, in the Modoc and Lassen, had started to answer the same questions, but they didn't stay there long enough to really even do their remeasurements or learn anything, but they were in the file. So I gathered all of them up, and I had a bunch of them. And I used that to somehow get a head start on some of the responses. And it turned out, and I kept those studies going my entire term with the station, and so they turned out to be useful for other things. And then I branched out a little bit. Well, so I had this idea of this growth and yield research and spacing, and then we went into initial spacing of plantations and the effect of brush competition in ponderosa pine plantations mostly, because that's where most of the plantation work was done. And then Bob and I also had another little study. It was designed rather narrowly, at least it was my study, or narrowly, and he on initiation of competition in an emerging plantation. So we had a lot of that study, and then we decided that, well, maybe we could enlarge that into have real growth and yield tables for ponderosa pine plantations, unthinned plantations. But there wasn't really enough information to base it on the existing literature, the foundation on existing literature. That some of it had to be in here without documentation. And, but somebody had to do it. I mean, it was needed to be done now. So we did that, and some of it was strictly out of thin air. And this was before really the computer age. We did get, about halfway through the whole thing, we did get a bunch of computers from, I don't know whether people will remember this, there was an Olivetti Underwood Programma 101, I think is the title. And it really was a calculator with that you could program, a little bit of programming calculator. And that saved our bacon too, because otherwise I'm not sure we would have been able to do it. And I had a lot of summer help grinding away on this stuff. But we were pretty much restricted on how deeply we could get into it because of the limits of the machine. But we put it out, and not in a referee journal. I don't think we would have made muster on a referee journal. We put it out as a station paper, which was later sort of sniffed out as gray literature. It became more and more considered to be not substandard, but not it didn't give you the credit that you would if it was a referee journal. That's because we chose our own reviewers. It's sort of an old boy network sort of thing. But we got it out, and the other thing was that we could get it out. At that time, the station had a lot of these publications, and they were widely distributed to ranger districts. Whereas if you had some esoteric journal, it might have been one that was written in the Netherlands, which was a big journal there, or England. Would that get to the district rangers? Probably not. So at the time, and my focus was on getting useful information out to the field. So even if we had that, even if it had been accepted, we probably wouldn't have done it that way. We would have gone through the station. So we did that, and I had another study that was going to be in this growth and yield, this west-wide growth and yield study. It was this younger plantation on a poorer site in the Mendocino. And it turned out to be, after 5 years, I realized that the spacing of the trees had no effect on the growth. It was the shrubs that were having effect on the shrub, so on the tree growth. So we subdivided the plots, and we had no shrubs, and then we had half shrubs and full shrubs. And that worked out all right, but we didn't, that was a different study. And then I decided that, we need to do another species too. So we did some work in red fir. We had a levels of growing stock study on the Swain Mountain Experimental Forest in red fir. And that was early on, and I didn't have too much domestic information on that, but we did that, and a couple places. So one of them was, and then since the ponderosa pine and the fir and the species in the west slope of the Sierra Nevada anyway, we're always in a mixture of species. Well, we need to tackle this the mixed conifer type. Well, how are we going to do that? And that was difficult. So we decided that we would plant a mixed conifer stand from scratch. And we had a place in the Challenge Experimental Forest southeast of Boroville. Low elevation, but a very high rainfall. And there was an area on a nice slope, or a southwest slope, which turned out to be fatal. But anyway, it was we planted it there in a design that was similar to one that Bill Libby used for thinning experiments. And it was on a hexagonal design. And if you look down the rows, it would be like you would seeing in a walnut orchard in the valley. And they weren't, so the spacing was on a kind of an angle. And that was so that we could have a subject species surrounded by various combinations of the other 5 mixed conifers. either all of the same species, so that would be, I would take in 5 treatments, or combinations of 2 of each of the others. And so we planted that, and we were thrilled with it, and we thought this design was so elegant, and this has got to be great, but it was not robust, what we would consider robust. In other words, it relied on almost total survival. But you see, we were only at 2,800 feet elevation on the southwest slope. We're planting white fir and Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, which then went like gangbusters, but also it's in cedar and sugar pine. And the survival on those was not good. And then the shrubs came in, and the whole thing sort of went out kapooey. And then my successor there, John Wei Zhang, still thinks that he can do something with it, but I don't know. I gave up on it. So, but it was an interesting. Some of these things in the research we get all excited about, but just don't quite work out. And that was one of them. Another one which did better, but it was less than we had hoped, was what'd you call it? Multidisciplinary, I guess you call it a multidisciplinary study in white fir on a piece of land, Lassen National Forest land near Swain Mountain. And it was white fir, young saw timber stand, wonderfully uniform. Oh, it's just a beautiful place, lots of room. So I got everybody together from Reading, and Powers was involved, and Jim Lackey, and Phil Weatherspoon. And we designed this study in which we would study the effect of various stocking levels on the growth and health of white fir. Bob Powers would do some fertilization on some other plots in there, also using the same stocking levels. And then Phil Weatherspoon would do the same and do prescribed burning before and after harvest. And then Jim Lackey wanted to log it by horses. And so that's what we started out doing. And we got the main thing, of course, is, oh my goodness, horses. How are we going to get the horses, how are we going to get the logging done in 1 year? And that was a little difficult. We sort of almost did it. I don't think it affected the study at all, but horse logging, the experience in horse logging had long since gone. So we got horses. They were show horses, Percherons from who spent their life on an irrigated pasture in Cottonwood, and only were out pulling at county fairs and things. So they were out there snaking logs out of the woods, and the horses are extremely impressive looking, but they were clumsy. I had no experience in dragging something behind and going between trees and so forth. And so they got all their shins and the lower legs scratched up, and the teamster was very careful with them, and when they broke into a sweat, it was time to quit, and so forth. And so that didn't work out. So then we got a bunch of old nags that had some experience, and they were sway backed, and they didn't look nearly as nice, but they had experience. And they got most of it done, horse logging, and so we got a little bit of information out on horse logging on that one. And then we had a little purge of personnel in the Reading office, and Bob Powers was fired at the time, And so some of his work didn't really get done very well. And well, that's another story I'm not sure you want to get into, but then eventually he won his case and came and was rehired. But that sort of put a crimp on the fertilization part. But Weatherspoon did the prescribed burning. And one of the deals with the prescribed burning was if we burned it, we could see that there was this shadow stems of ceanothus, ceanothus is an understory. In other words, it's trees that come up through a ceanothus shrubland. We could see them there. So we know there's lots of seed there in the duff. So if we burn it, can we kill enough of the seed to prevent its reappearance? And also, of course, we expected a lot of reappearance since when he opened the stand up that there'd be some sprouting. There really wasn't much sprouting. No, but he did document the effect of prescribed burning on the seed bank. See, Don Gordon had done some cutting in the Swain Mountain experimental forest, the first cutting in an old growth. That was old growth. And he didn't have much of a problem with brush invasion. However, he would take groups out and show them these places without much shrub invasion. And most of the people that came by would say, that's not our experience. And what they did is they weren't the first ones going into an old-growth forest. They were cutting in an already opened-up area but had a previous cutting. And then so that there was new invasion, which but apparently the ceanothus, I think it was ceanothus cuneatus. No, not cuneatus. Oh, what we call whitethorn. I've forgotten the scientific name. Apparently that seed source did not last 300 years like the red fir forest, about the age of the red fir forest in Swain Mountain. But they did last 100 years or so, which was about the age of the stuff at the little study where we had at Jenny Springs. So anyway, Phil retired before he got it out, but I think it was published by Eric Knapp, who is there now. So that was another study, and that went on until, you remember New Perspectives. And finally, the Forest Service decided that, hey, there's society really wasn't interested in having the Forest Service being timber-oriented. There were other things that the forest was valuable for, rather than just timber. And it took many years, but anyway, we finally got into it in the late 80s, or about 1990 maybe. So, we ought to respond to this. And so I decided that and then Phil Ani was a program manager there. And he was all for it. So I sent out a letter to all people in the station, all scientists in the station, saying, look, we got to get together and have some sort of interdisciplinary environmental study that we take everything, look at as much of the aspects of the forest as we can. So we got a lot of varying and diverse scientists here. And so we had a couple of meetings. One of them was down at Stanislaus, to trying to find out if we had a resource where we could put a big study in. And so we went down to Stanislaus, and we had a study there, had a meeting there, decided that wasn't any good because we were in the middle of a watershed, and the forest had already had a lot of big clear cuts at the upper part of the watershed. We couldn't control the environment there. So that didn't work out. And the idea was that, of course, we had these grandiose plans that we would have one of these big multidisciplinary studies in the major forest types in Northern California. We would have one in the Douglas fir area, and we would have one in the west slope of the Sierra Nevada, and we would have one in the northeastern California, in ponderosa pine. Well, the west slope of the Sierra Nevada was not available. We didn't have enough area. There are varying proportions of the mixed conifer. Besides, it's all tied up with this and that. And same with the northwestern California with the spotted owl business and all that. No, you couldn't do anything there of any area. We wanted something that was replicable, had replications. We just didn't want to do something and then without any replications and nothing that you could put a statistical test to. So so that left northeastern California and left Black's Mountain Experimental Forest. We had a study there that was begun in the late 30s on methods of cutting old growth. And they were large study plots, 20 acres. And a 20-acre parcel was put in each year for 10 years. So we had 200 acres right there in a fairly uniform condition. It had been entered to some extent, but not much. So we decided, okay, we'll spend 1 year and we'll clean up we remeasure those plots and complete that study, and we will superimpose this other study on it, which we did. And it was and we hired a forester from off the Plumas, Kathy Harkson. And so she was supposed to do the nuts and bolts things and the coordination. And she was a go-getter, and turned out to be, she did her job, but she stepped on a lot of toes. But she had to step on a lot of toes in order to get the job done because, well, I won't go into it, but the Forest Service was somewhat reluctant to change. We were kind of a headache to them. And they, it's another thing, oh my gosh, what are they doing now, and that sort of thing. And we got our other jobs and so forth. And so, but she had to nag, and she did. And we got because you see, the logging to do the study, it turned out to be the largest green sale in the country at that time in order to establish the study. I can't remember how many thousand board feet or tens or hundreds of thousands of board feet we came out of there, but there were a lot. Because we had two major cutting areas. We had a thinning in the old growth, keeping the old growth, spacing the old growth out, but had a lot of them removed. Plus we had all the old growth removed from half of it, which was, and then the understory thinned to a uniform condition. So it was supposed to contrast old growth with young growth, and as far as insects and disease and birds and small rodents, and as well as the growth. And so we got it going, and we got a couple of years out of it, but the problem always has been is that the management is looking in terms of 5 years or less. Well, they don't have any, Washington, D.C. isn't going to fund it very, very long. And so we agonized over that in our meetings. Says, what are we going to do? Well, if we can build it, and then if we can get it, the initial measurements done, and if we can get the first 5 years measurements, that'd be good. But after that, if things deteriorate and we can't do anything more, well, maybe in 20 years, we'll have enough money to start it up again or remeasure it. And that's sort of what, actually, Martin Ritchie he came in not at the beginning, but fairly early on in the study, and he's had a lot of loyalty to it and interest in it. And he's able to keep the thing going, at least as far as the trees are concerned. And the insect work was done, but the small mammals and the birds, we had to find somebody else to do it. I tried to get University of Nevada, Reno involved, because they were close. They could come right up from Reno, and that was the closest. I couldn't get the people from Arcata to do it. They were caught up in the spotted owl business, and they had more than they could handle there. And besides, we were cutting trees, and they were sort of philosophically against that. Some of the bird work was done through Humboldt State. We gave them a grant of money. It was can't think of the fellow's name now. He's gone. And he had a bunch of grad students, and then that came, but mostly they came on another study after we got the one at Black's Mountain going. Kathy Harkson, she just loved getting the thing started, but she didn't do data, as she said. So she wanted to do one on the Goose Nest Adaptive Management Area. You remember adaptive management area was a study as a setup by the Forest Service to have a kind of a experimental forest area scattered around through the Northwest. It's all part of the spotted owl business. And one of them was on the Goose Nest district of the Klamath Forest, which is the far eastern district out of Butte Valley between near Doris and that area. On the west, it was on the north slope of what I call the Medicine Lake Highlands, east of Mount Shasta. And there's a large area of ponderosa pine and white fir, mostly ponderosa pine, in a much higher site than Black's Mountain. And it was all young growth, 120 years or so. Part of the old Abner Weed Lumber Company and Long Bell Lumber Company logging, railroad logging. Long, gentle north-facing slope. Ideal for something. And so we had a different design there. We were going to study different partial cuttings in young growth pine, pretty much like what most people were faced with these days, rather than old growth. Then we had I can't remember now, but one of them was like there were several cutting methods. And we started that, and that worked out pretty well, and we had some pretty good cooperation with the district ranger. He was pretty enthusiastic about it. And that we've had a hard time maintaining because the money dried up, and we didn't. But at first we had some people grad students from from Humboldt State did some interesting work. At least I was interested in it because I was a bird watcher. And one of them was a dusky flycatcher, which is a small flycatcher that nests in shrubs. And he had set up some cameras on a delayed reaction, so he was able to take a time-delayed camera shots of these dusky flycatcher nests to determine their predation. And everybody thought, oh, well, it's got to be snakes and other birds and that sort of thing. Well, yes, a little bit. But then a deer or a bear would blunder through and mess up the nest site. But the great predation on the eggs and nestlings of the dusky flycatcher were golden-mantled ground squirrels. The little fuzzy things, and then you think if they couldn't do anything that would harm anybody. But they were fierce predators. And the other one was we did prescribe burning in both Black's Mountain and at Goose Nest. And at Goose Nest, a woman there that was studying nesting success of dark-eyed juncos in burned and unburned areas. And the idea was that since dark-eyed juncos are ground nesters, that if you burn off, have a prescribed burning off all the ground vegetation, that they're going to have a hard time. Well, some of them did nest in trees, which was not realized before. But most of them would then go into these burnt out stumps, and maybe they would go into the old burnt out roots, little tunnels, and they would build a nest in there. And when they did, they were able to fledge more than they would than in the unburned areas. Well, that's totally against the previous thought. Well, how is that? Well, it turns out that they caught insects to feed the young ones. They had greater success in catching the insects and feeding the young ones faster than they would in the unburned. So they were able to. There was more insects, and so then she put in a bunch of sticky traps to find. And in fact, yes, there were more insects. And I don't know. Then she left that she was going to have the insects identified, but I don't know. But anyway, didn't have to worry about the dark-eyed juncos and a prescribed burn because they did just fine. And that was interesting. And as far as I know, that's about. I don't know what else has been found at Goose Nest, but we have some work done at some reports out on the Black's Mountain study. But again, it's only been 15 years, and this whole thing was set up for a long period of time. Well, one of the perks you could get in the research thing is that they're interested in having you not just sit there in one little area, but get a world view or something. So early on, well, in the early 80s, I had been with the station 20 years, about half the way through my career. I had an opportunity to go to Chile, and only just Chile wanted to invite as guests 2 people from the U.S. Forest Service because they had come up here and it was a reciprocal thing. And they came, and we have this arrangement with Chile because Chile is in the southern hemisphere equivalent of California in almost every way possible. So we went down there, was down there a couple of weeks, and it turned out that the person that arranged the trips there was Bertram Hush, And he was my mensuration professor at the University of New Hampshire. And probably the most demanding teacher I had in forestry. And we all hated him at the time, of course. But then later on, we figured, he was good for us. And he had left the University of New Hampshire and then I think almost immediately got a job with the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And they had a project in Chile, and so he went down there, and then he stayed there, and he married a Chilean woman, and he had a consulting firm down there and everything, and he's passed away maybe 5 years ago now. Anyway, I didn't even think about him as being down there. I didn't put it together, so when he was there, it was very surprising. And he said, well, who did you expect it was going to be here? And, well, if I had thought about it, of course I would have. But, so he took us all around. And then, of course, the thing that changed my life was I met this woman down there and subsequently married her from Chile. And so that enlarged my worldview quite a bit. And then I had to bring her here to Reading and her son. That was quite a deal. But she handled it pretty well, and she was in the executive secretary. Well, the reason I knew about her, that I came in contact with her, was that one of the people down there, there was arranging a meeting on a social gathering, and I said, "Oh, we need somebody who can translate for these guys." And so Jimena, was her name, Jimena Moreno, can do that. She was totally bilingual. Was executive secretary for a lot of the large corporations in there. She worked for Goodyear and General Motors and Fluor Minings and Metals and maybe a couple others. And she was towards the end, was executive secretary for the people in charge there and so she came and then did a lot of volunteer work, and then got a job as an interpreter and worked for the courts, and that was very lucrative, and it was an important thing. So she did Spanish, English in the court system. She worked all through Northern California. And I went around we did a lot of work in Lake County and Mendocino County and Yuba County and Butte County and Lassen County, and once in a while up in Modoc, although they didn't have too many. Mostly it was farm workers and others what we would call immigrants of questionable status. Mm-hmm. And of course they had injuries, or they were DUIs and traffic problems because they didn't have a license and all that sort of stuff. And it kept her busy. Oh, and then on the coast there was abalone fishermen. So it was a varied career, and I went with her lots of times. But that was the main thing. But except that going through around Chile, you see, Chile had this great industry on exotic pines. They had when I was in grade school, we took something we called geography. I think that's unknown now. But we did take geography, and a lot of it was economic geography. And I remember learning that Chile had a great wheat export. It was one of their major exports in those days. Well, over the years, they were through the ruinous agricultural things. Most of the wheat land was was burned out. I mean, it was very, erosion and so forth. So it was no longer usable. So there's a tremendous amount of old wheatland that was sitting there, and they decided that they would plant trees because trees are less demanding of the site, nutrients on the site than annual crops. So they found a Monterey pine, Pinus insignia they call it, and they had thousands of acres of Monterey pine. And now Monterey pine saw timber and pulpwood is the second largest export, second only to copper. It has been for years. So they were doing a lot of work on plantations down there, and so it was interesting to see. And a lot of it was more advanced than we could do here because they had only a 20 to 25 year rotation, unlike here, which is twice or three times. So they could afford to put more money into it than we can. It wasn't that we didn't have the knowledge, it's just that no one had the financial wherewithal to justify it. And so they did a lot of work. And the other thing was there was an awful lot of work on the on nutrients, and of course, and there were some fabulous, spectacular nutrient deficiency diseases down there, which we didn't have here. So, but it was just interesting to see. And the other one was, of course, this was a big monoculture. Now there are trials and tribulations and advantages of having that, but so far they've been able to handle it well, of course, this year they had terrible fires, but that wasn't because of the monoculture. That was the same reason that we've had the fires, I guess. And but they did have some diseases which were troublesome. But so we studied that. But as I say, the major thing that came out of it was I got myself a wife out of it. And then the other one was that in 1990, 10 years later, I applied for a assignment with the FAO. This was with the Pacific Islands Forests and Trees, a portion of the FAO, which is the number of little compartments in the United Nations is just absolutely mind-boggling. But this was a little one of these things, and it was. They were assisting the little island nations in the Southwest Pacific, in Melanesia and Polynesia, and a little bit in Micronesia, but most of this was south of the equator. And they wanted, the Forest Service was an advisor to this organization of heads of forestry for these 7 or 8 little island nations. And they agreed to finance a person to come down there and study the plantation practices of all these little countries and then write a report so that all the nations there and that would know what everybody else was doing, since they're so isolated by thousands of miles between countries and the ocean. That there was a lot of reinventing the wheel and all that sort of stuff. So I went down there for 2 months. A week to 10 days in each of 7 nations. Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, which you might remember as New Hebrides, New Caledonia, which is something else, Tonga, Fiji, Cook Islands, Samoa, Well, I had 7 or 8. They were 7 or 8 of them. And I went down and they studied all their practices. They took me around, showed me what they were doing, and I wrote all this stuff down, took pictures, wrote a report. And then 9 years later, they wanted a follow-up. And I went down there again. There was a follow-up. And made a report again. And it was interesting, the changes. For one thing, when I went down there the first time, they were going gangbusters on plantations and so forth because they had a lot of money from grants, from foreign aid. It was Australia and New Zealand and the EU, European Economic Union, not much from the United States. But they were pushing plantations. They got a lot of money. And they were planting and thinning, and they had three major species, but maybe 4 or 5. But anyway, the major one was Caribbean pine, which is like our slash pine, but it's in the Caribbean area. And teak and broadleaf mahogany. And then they had some eucalypts. And but it did. And they were, and so it was, it was real interesting to do it. Then when I went back to see what was going on, I could see why they want me going back, because all the money dried up for the plantations. All the European money and the Australian and New Zealand money dried up. They all went into rehabbing natural forests. It was sort of like, these trends are worldwide. Often we tend to think of them as just the United States. And then we're always surprised that, no, everybody's doing the same damn thing. And so that the foreign aid for plantations dried up. And so these poor guys hardly had any money, and they had these nurseries. And how are they going to finance the nurseries? Well, they went into horticulture, and they were selling. They were growing shrubs and so forth, and trying to make money. And the forest trees were in the back and not well managed, and so they were dried out. And so they were still planting in Tonga. I remember they were still planting them, but they were planting dead trees essentially, and they knew it. And when I got back. Well, I made a reported on all this stuff, but when I got back, Kevin O'Hara invited me to give a little seminar to his silviculture group down there, and John Helms was there, I remember, and I went on, and he said, "Well, Bill, what did you tell them? What information did you tell them?" And I had a heck of a time answering that, because they knew all the stuff that I could tell them. But the problems they had were not of technology, not a lack of technical knowledge. They were structural, societal structures and land management, land ownership problems and all that sort of stuff. Because it's like somewhat similar, but not quite. Like in Mexico, we're a little more closely related to know what's going on in Mexico, where a lot of the land is community owned. Ejidas, in Mexico, and down there, the national government owns very little land. So what the government was doing, and what they had done in the past, was they had a forestry department. Well, they didn't have any land, but they would make arrangements with these communities to lease land for forest purposes, which they did. And much of the land that was leased, though, was in the 30s. So, and these older plantations were now merchantable, and so they were merchantable. So now they wanted, the community saw this resource out here, this monetary resource that could turn into money anyway. And so they wanted it. And so they would sue to get the money back. And the forest departments didn't like that because they were trying to manage it into the way they thought was best. But when it went to court, the courts wanted, where's the records from the 30s? Well, it had 3 fires in the building, and they had the Second World War, and most of the records are gone. It was just word of mouth. So the outcome of the courts thing was that the courts sided with the village because, it's their land. You say government has a lease, but we don't have any records of that. You can't provide anything. So so then the villagers go in and clear cut, all this stuff. And it was really disheartening to the state forestry departments. And I felt sorry for them for that, yeah. And but you wonder about the whole idea of growing these trees for export, because most of the wood would go to Japan, and mostly was pulpwood. It was other stuff too. Other Japanese, would have lots of fine work, but each little nation could only produce so much, and not even a shipload. So this poor ship would have to go from 3 or 4 ports to get enough to ship to Japan to fill up the ship. And this has made it very expensive. And so the amount of money they could get for it is not very good. And there's lots of other problems, but mostly that was what it was. It was just that they didn't have any money to do the management. For instance, we went to the Cook Islands, and there was one island. It's not Rotorua, where you think about it, although I was there, but most of these places where I went were just little volcanic islands with no, for instance, going off a field here, but on Samoa, Western Samoa, which now they call themselves Samoa, I was on the weekend, I wanted to go to one of the nice little sandy beaches with the overhanging palms and all that sort of stuff, let you read about. In fact, there was a movie with Gary Cooper and somebody called Paradise Island. It was made in Samoa. All right, well, let's go there. Well, we had to take a bus all the way across the island to the only patch of white sand, apparently in the whole island, with overhanging palms, and that's where the movie was made. And then it was surrounded by lava, pillow lava, and there was pillow lava in the just beneath the surface of the water. So if you were swimming, you had to watch out so your knee didn't hit one of those lava things that would just lacerate yourself. And so things weren't as one would expect. The one on Cook Islands was a volcano on top of a limestone island. So there was a volcano in the middle. So they had grown pineapples on the thing. And when the pineapple industry died, they planted Caribbean pine. Now the Caribbean pine had good survival, and the Caribbean pine was very close. They needed to thin it, do something with it. Well, how are they going to do it? And so I said, well, remember here in Reading, one of the fellows was pushing a sort of a farm tractor-based skidding system where you hung this rope in a circle around the trees, and then you had these drums on the farm tractor, and you could haul the logs. Well, how much does it cost? Well, he was going to send it to me, and then how much does it cost? Well, you ought to be able to get the whole thing for $10,000. So I took it down there, and no, there wasn't any, no $10,000. Didn't, no, they couldn't afford that. And so I guess they were hauling it up, but it was steep slopes. Hauling the stuff up. There was another place in in Papua New Guinea, near Mount Hagen, which is in the uplands. A big swamp area. They were growing Eucalyptus grandis, which is a very nice eucalypt. And when I was there, they were hand carrying the logs from the up to the roadside, and just hand carrying them. Well, why was that? Well, they had imported some water ox or oxen from Southeast Asia to do the logging, but the New Guineans had no experience with draft animals, and they all escaped, and they went on. They're off. So they lost them all, so they had to do it all by hand. And what they had done is they had ditched this big swamp, so drained all the water out so that they could grow the eucalypts, and they were doing very nicely. And I think there was a market there in New Guinea. There was a less land area in New Guinea, but these other little ones, I don't know what they would have done. They didn't come across any alternative other than they could rehab the logged over rainforest. The problem with the logged over forest, they suffered an awful lot from the Second World War. It's hard to imagine how transformed the country was. There's landing strips there done with. You remember reading Tales of the South Pacific, Robert Michener's stories about how to make coral landing strips. And you'd dig up the coral and you'd spread it out, and then you'd water it long enough because it's living material, and you keep it wet with salt water enough so that the coral would fuse. And it was very successful, and still there's landing strips out there that you could land a plane on, and they're 50, 60 years old. Well, maybe a person with a machete could go down there and whack a few plants out here and there, but no, pretty much bare, solid pavement. And there's a lot of Quonset huts still around. They're using them for this and that. And there was one place where they couldn't figure out why the trees wouldn't grow very well there. And they dug down deep, and here it was an old dump of military vehicles. It was just beneath the surface, just below when they planted, they were still, they didn't hit it, but just below that. So there really was very little soil there. Yeah, it's a strange place, but I got a real appreciation of the fact that in many cases we sort of naively go into a place and think that all they need is a little more technical skill. But no, it's not that. It's the whole idea that the whole social structure is working against you. And anyway, that was very, very evident down there. I grew up in not even a rural subdivision. It was just a subdivision of, the bedroom community of Trenton, New Jersey. And father was a landscape gardener, so he was doing raking leaves and so forth. That was quite a long ways from forestry. As I said, I went out once with the assistant state forester for the state of New Jersey, and we did a little woodlot of red maple. Hardly a forest experience. And so I came out here, and I found a home in Berkeley, all right. People of like mind and everything, but it was tough here in Reading, yeah. And furthermore, I wasn't in forest management. I was in the research end, and so I had a few friends, but my friends were generally outside the forest community. And it was, I don't know whether, anyway, it took a lot of getting used to. I came up here and immediately I thought, oh, it's too hot and the climate is not very good here, and I wanted to go somewhere else. So I tried to so the two places I could think of that were working in the same sort of forest conditions that I was now becoming used to was Bend, Oregon, where they had a silviculture project there with the Pacific Northwest Station, and Flagstaff, Arizona. But they they couldn't make a switch or anything. So I said, after you're here for a while, it's your home. You see, when I came to Reading, it was Doug Roy, myself, and then shortly thereafter Phil McDonald and Bob Powers and Don Gordon. And then we brought in Jim Lackey from the UC Berkeley extension and Phil Weatherspoon. And there were 8 of us, I think, at one time. And then Leroy Dolph was here. Leroy Dolph was a soil scientist, actually, from the Inyo, and he came and on a specific assignment, and that was to do a local version of the forest vegetation simulator, Al Stage's growth and yield simulator, and do it for the west slope of the Sierra Nevada. And he did it for that, and he did one for True Fir. But anyway, we had quite a few people here, and then they started to retire and drift away, and now there's only 3. Martin Ritchie came early on. He was here when it was almost fully stocked. And then we had, they hired, I forgot Carl Skinner. So there were 8. But anyway, then Martin Ritchie was he's a statistician, more mathematical statistician that we hired. And Eric Knapp, an ecologist. Well, there's only Martin Ritchie, Eric Knapp, and the person they hired to replace me, which a fellow named Zhang Zhang, who's from China. Well, he's been here for a long time, but he was originally educated in China. And the money has dried up to the point where we have the roof. They have the roof over their heads, and they have so they have their office, and they have their salary, and that's it, pretty much. They have maybe a few dollars, but not much. So they're having looked for grants from this and that. Many of the grants come from the Forest Service. They sort of contract with us for things. And I know John Way is doing a lot of work on the old Story fire. I don't know how old that is. It's maybe 10 years ago, 20. It was on, I think, on Highway 50. And they wanted to know, I don't know how, not sure exactly what they want to know, but it was a monitoring project, which means you go out and you do a survey. Maybe you have permanent plots there, but there's no replication. You're just finding out what's happening on that particular fire area, and whether you can make a generalization to somewhere else over a fire on the other side of the hill or something. That's an open question, since you have no measure of variation, say, of conditions. But it's money. And you can always, and apparently what they are doing is they're nesting in this general monitoring thing an actually replicated study of something. And I don't know the details of it. But there's a little difficulty in the Forest Service is making the distinction between monitoring and research. And that the research, you have to have something that you can analyze and determine statistically that there is a difference here and there and or not. But if you're just monitoring, you have no replications, which is the main thing. And so there's no way to understand whether these results are transportable elsewhere. And so it's pretty difficult to get something like that published in a journal. Well, we have a difficulty in forestry research and in forestry in growth and yield or whatever was silviculture or genetics or something, with the fact that the human administration and human nature is 5 years at the outset. That's a long ways away, and that's just a blink of the eye for a tree. So I was able to get some information because I was here for 40 years. Not too many people stay in one spot in 40 years. No, I'm not sure exactly how that happened. Maybe I was low-key and kept my mouth shut, and they forgot me, and so here I am. But anyway, that was a sizable length of time for trees. So you begin to really see trends, which you read about in textbooks, but you seldom see. And that is, if say a lot of these studies were where I had a wide range of spacings, there was quite a bit of difference in the amount of growth that you'd get between spacings. But as the trees grow up, it all comes together up there and at some point, and it doesn't make any difference what happened early on. It all comes out the same at the end, maybe. And so I was able to, show that in many cases, that like that study at Elliott Ranch was that way. Everything's sort of coming, volumes, standing volumes, or whatever you want to call it. The tree sizes are different, but everything else is about the same. Well, the future, which we haven't been able to realize, is these ecosystem studies, large-term ecosystem studies, to find out the effect of on other components of the ecosystem of what you're doing. And we need a lot of work on that. But that takes, that's expensive. So we started a lot of these, and we have this committee, and we, like at Black's Mountain and at Goose Nest, and to some extent some of the others, that Well, it's naive to think that we can complete these things. Well, we're not going to complete them in our lifetime anyway, but that they would be even maintained during our lifetime. And that's more or less true, but you just can't sit back and not try anyway. And who knows that some of these things they'll find money somewhere. And Martin still has hopes. I started at the beginning talking about all these little growth and yield administrative studies that I found and continued to study. Then it occurred to me that, these long-term plots could be used to test out the minus 3/2 power rule. The minus 3/2 power rule is a maximum stand density, which any organism, trees, goldfish in a pond, plants of any kind, they reach a certain density and then they can't go any further. There's a maximum. And it was back in the 60s somewhere. It hit the Japanese literature. Somebody devised this, and they said, well, the maximum biomass, if you plot biomass over age or something, it will come up to a maximum, and then mortality sets in, and it has a slope that is minus 3/2. But the elevation it varies, but the slope doesn't. Well, turns out that one of our old mensurationists from the Pacific Southwest Station, Lou Reinecke, published an obscure in the Journal of Agricultural Research, which was a publication put out by the USDA, where a lot of the early forestry literature was. He called it the stand density index. And so I don't think he's ever been, except for Martin and myself, have ever given Lou Reinecke the credit he deserves. But you probably knew stand density index, something a little bit. It's never used. It was taken over by using basal area as a measure of stand density, because basal area you can measure it so easily with a little prism thing or whatever. Nothing is intuitive in stand density index. You have to know the number of trees and their average diameter or this and that, and then you compute that. But you can't just look at a stand and say, oh, that has a stand density index of such and such. And it's not immediately transferable into basal area either. But anyway, Lou Reinecke did that. So I thought, I can take all these plots, some of them are 50, 60 years old, and plot their diameter and number of trees, because I can't get I don't have biomass, although I could compute biomass, but I have at least their average stand diameter and their number of trees. And that can be, that has sort of the same response as total biomass, not quite. And then I could plot these and show this, what these maximum stand density would be for ponderosa pine before it just collapses. And so I had all these plots, and so some of them came to good use in that respect. And Martin started, and John Reyes went on with it a bit more, and Martin's working on it now, and they're refining it some. A lot of people complained that I had this maximum stand density too low, and you had to do these. In fact, there was a a suit brought in by Earth Island Institute or somebody against the Forest Service because they used my maximum stand density as a guide in their thinning, ponderosa pine over there near Black's Mountain. And the Forest Service finally won the suit, but it was, a lot of people felt that it was too severe. But I said, well, yeah, wait until we have a big drought or something, and then you'll wonder. I don't know that, I'm not sure that I was able to prove that with the drought. I don't think it's really happened that way up here in the north. In the south it may have been, but the beetles became so popular, so prevalent that I think it absolutely wiped out the stand. Well, I had a few of my plots there at Elliott Ranch, which are decimated, totally gone, only had a half a dozen trees left in a half acre, all bark beetles killed. But that was an unthinned stand, see? And so the bark beetles are episodic, and you can get very high stand densities go on for a decade or two, and then all of a sudden, boom. But you have to realize that you have to think of the long term in your forestry, and what's 10 years or even a couple of decades. It's been useful. Those long-term plots, they turn out to provide information you had no idea that you could ever use, and it didn't take too much time to measure them. John Lee took a lot of my research and has reworked it with some heavy mathematical gobbledygook or something. I can't really understand. I have a hard time believing that he's really making something believable out of it. But it's all, well, it's possible with modern day computers. But I'm sort of back in the dark ages as far as this statistical analysis is concerned. And later on, yeah, he was using my data and did things. Well, he was taking dissimilar studies and somehow being able to measure the variation due to dissimilar designs and so forth, which I didn't think were possible. And but he gets them published, and the results are believable, but exactly how they became how he could tell others that it was believable, I don't know. As I said at the beginning, that I chose at first to publish through the station, well, for two reasons. One of them was some of it was maybe not some of it were suppositions that were not quite supported, not untrue, but you couldn't support it with references and things. And the other one was I wanted to get the information out, and I don't know what they're doing today because the station doesn't have much of a publication organization. They expect you to publish through journals, which are fine. But one of the problems with a journal is that, of course, you're restricted with graphs and photographs and things. You can't do much of that, and they don't make it very user-friendly. And it doesn't get to the degree. I don't think many of the people in ranger districts or commercial forestry outfits have subscriptions to many of these journals. Well, as I said, that when I was getting out of high school, I wanted to get a well-rounded liberal arts education. And I wasn't totally successful there. Because I felt I had to get a job, and my mother was now widowed and so forth. So I didn't, but I did do a little catch up at the University of Michigan. But I would say, and I think that forestry education is different than it was back in the 50s. Then it was more of a training school, I think. I think it's more of a broad thing. But I think there's no, you should try to get as much of a liberal education as you can, so you can be, because really what you need is be well-grounded in mathematics and in English. And the rest of the stuff is secondary. And unfortunately, I was not too well-grounded in mathematics. And that was a big problem. See, I didn't think that I would have to be too much, because I was thinking I was more ecophysiology, and that was did my master's degree and so forth. But when I came here, the job was growth and yield, young growth management. And that's where so I did what was needed. I tried to stay away from the heavy mathematics, and then I got stuck with it. I guess I became a quantitative silviculturist, I guess you'd call it. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire. We weren't accredited then, but when I left the University of Michigan, most of my colleagues were members, and I had gone to SAF meetings, the New England region, out of Boston a couple of times when I was an undergraduate. And, this is a place you should belong, Also, I thought it was necessary, and I was in favor of certification when that came up. And so I jumped on that and became certified, possibly because by that time my experience had become so narrow, I don't think I could have passed the test. So I grandfathered in, It kept me up with the the discipline, yeah. And about the time that I thought about maybe it's time that I was onto other things, then they made it free. Well, I have seen some that have been well managed, and it would be you might call more than uneven aged. I mean, it's almost all age management, and some of them are very beautiful. And there's some beautiful stands up that I've been dealing with later in my career up at Black's Mountain, which are very beautiful. Not left to their own devices, however. They've got to be burned, and they've got to be, you have to well, it's interesting because the stands there's been a lot of interest and a lot of research, well, not necessarily research, but investigation. So what exactly led to the condition of the forests when the first Europeans came? And of course, a lot of them it was fire dominated, especially, even throughout the South. And the Native Americans fired off a lot of stuff, so. But, we left the fire, we assumed that the fires was a bad thing, and, it was burned up a lot of valuable timber. That's how it got started, this fire suppression stuff, but paying the price now. But, yeah, it has to be, and very open. These forests up in northeastern California, there were only about 50 trees per acre, which I keep telling people about. 50 trees per acre. Say, well, that's. Of course, they were very large trees too, and then there was enough room there for regeneration. But the regeneration doesn't have to be needed, except only just very sparse, because it. But then again, you need some of it has to be managed for forest products, and we can do that too. We just have to. We just have to make sure that we have the forests open enough so that they don't get all burned up. But I've seen some on a forestry tour, SAF tour in Central Sierras that were beautiful, and they were some forester, I think, he had owned quite a bit of land, and he did it right, and then they were beautiful forests, and he cut regularly in there, but not an awful lot per acre, but he did cut regularly. No, I'm not looking for ponderosa pine plantations of 40 years old and uniform, no. But for instance, the one down there on this Tahoe at Elliott Ranch would take people through it, and they'd see a lot of regeneration of the more tolerant conifers. There was a little riparian strip there, and so there was seed from sugar pine and white fir and then some cedar coming in. And they said, well, why don't you encourage that and show how you can convert from a ponderosa pine plantation to a mixed conifer, which is the way it would be naturally. And I said, yeah, that's fine, but that would eliminate the original purpose of it, and we could do that somewhere else. But I could show them that if you thinned it enough, these pine plantations thin them enough, where there is a seed source from the others, that you can encourage that, and that is definitely a good thing to do. No, I have always felt like I was a fish out of water here in the West. And then I thought, well, why don't I go back east? But back east is so crowded. And I don't know. I didn't want to go through there. All the places, and furthermore, every place that I knew is totally transformed. I wouldn't recognize anything. For instance, we have a little summer house, I owned part with my siblings, a cottage up in New Hampshire, but I sold my part of it. And the reason was that I had no interest in going up there and looking back where we used to have fun as a kid 70 years ago. No, it would be disappointing. I wouldn't want to go there. I went up to the northern peninsula of Michigan, to my old place there in south of Marquette, a little town, about the size of Cottonwood maybe, or a little less, a little smaller. And I asked about some people on the street about things, and they didn't know. I knew more about the history than they did. They'd come they'd only lived there 20 years, you see. It's been 50 years since I was there. And I recognized some things, but it wasn't a pleasant experience. Well, since I retired, I always had a hobby of birding, a lifelong hobby. My mother got me started when I was 9 years old, I guess. So that's taken up a lot of my time since retiring. And I went down to Chile in November, spent a month down there, because I had been there many times with my wife. But when we went down there, I I just did backyard bird watching because we were visiting our friends and relatives. This time I decided that I would do it upright and top to bottom. And it's a country that's 4,000 kilometers long and maybe at the maximum 200 kilometers wide. So I got on with a local Chilean tour company, birding tour company, and we spent 3 weeks. 1 week up and down along near the Peruvian border, Peru and Bolivia, up in the Altiplano. And, from the coast all the way up. I didn't realize how high we were. We went from the coast, Arica, which is a city there, up to a little town called Putre, which was at 11,500 feet. And then we went up several thousand feet higher than that to the Altiplano, to the Lauca National Park. And I didn't know how high we were, except I knew we were high because it was hard to keep, out of breath all the time and very slow walking. Until I got back and got into one of my little laptop and Googled it, Google Earthed it, found out we were at 14,600 feet. And that was the surface area of the lake, and we were several hundred feet above that. And I guess if I had known it, I would have been really out of breath. But anyway, we did that okay. I was the oldest one there by 15, 20 years, but had a good time. And then we spent another week or 10 days in the central part around the capital city, Santiago, in the mountains, and went up into the Andes and then the coast. And then the last part in Tierra del Fuego down, it didn't get quite down to the point, Cape Horn, but we were in the island of Tierra del Fuego. And I can see why the Pinochet regime sent a lot of their enemies down there in exile into Tierra del Fuego, because the wind blows, it's west wind that blows continuously, 30 to 40 miles an hour, wind, and always at between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius, Fahrenheit. So it's not a very pleasant place, and it's mostly rolling steppe is what they call it. Yeah. So a lot of birds, a lot of animals, all the South American camels, the guanacos and the vicuñas and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.